Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same. Our guests today are two people who have a deep understanding of the world of psychometrics. They can be called experts in this field. Kirstin Davis is an independent occupational psychologist who specialises in assessment, development and coaching. She is British Psychological Society Level A and Level B qualified. Kirstin has over 20 years of experience using psychometric tests. These include the MTQ+, 16PF, 15FQ, FIRO-B, MBTI, OPQ, Hogan, and the EQI. So her experience is wide and varied. Almost all of her work includes some form of assessment using psychometric tests. Her colleague, Euan Woolley, is also an independent occupational psychologist who also specialises in assessment, development and coaching. And together, Kirstin and Euan, working closely together, have jointly created an occupational psychometrics test user program, which can lead to accreditation by the British Psychological Society. This would qualify delegates to join the register of qualified test users in ability and personality assessments. So we welcome both to this discussion on an increasingly important topic. Well, welcome, Kirstin and Euan. Welcome to our Talking Toughness podcast. How are you both today?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, feeling very mentally tough today. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great. We're really looking forward to exploring a couple of really interesting topics with you today. But I think we can start off with psychometrics, and we might step into perhaps a little bit of controversy. If you were to look at social media at the moment, there is an awful lot on social media about psychometrics. And there are two, three big themes, but one of the themes is a lot of highly respected psychologists and psychometricians are tearing their hair out at the state of psychometrics. And quite commonly you'll hear the four most popular psychometric tests used around the world shouldn't be used. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that?
So, I think there is an awful lot going on in universities about this at the moment as well. The four most used are not that reliable or valid. I think that's what's coming out of all the research and things. However, lots of people do like them. You know, they like their simplicity and they do get something. I'm not sure what that is, but they do get something out of it, whether that's just a starting off of a talking point. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's really interesting, and certainly all the university graduates that are coming out now are saying, "Oh, you can't use that. You know, that's not reliable and valid." What do you think, Euan?
Yeah, I agree. I think almost there's an inverse relationship between the reliability of psychometrics and their popularity sometimes. Some of the most popular ones used in industry are not necessarily very reliable, not necessarily very valid in the things that they're meant to be assessing. But they can be so popular because I suppose they connect with people's stories, perhaps in a way that some of the more scientific ones don't. And it's a balance really, working out which ones to use. But I think another thing is there's a lack of awareness sometimes amongst people as to how to choose good psychometrics. People don't really have much awareness about what what makes a good psychometric, and then how to use it, how to interpret it. So I think there's a lack of education really about how to make best use of psychometrics.
It's an interesting point you make there as well, related to it's kind of a two-way street where there are those. I don't even refer to them as psychometrics really, because by definition, a psychometric test should be scientifically rigorous, and if it's never actually been scientifically tested, such as most of those popular ones, I don't know that it really meets the criteria to be called a psychometric, but it does. Anyway, that's an aside. But I think it's a good point that it's also a bit of a two-way street, in that there are also some, in academic literature, there's personality type assessments in psychometrics journals that are developed by researchers for researchers. And the goal of them is to elicit some insight into some sort of theoretical personality variable that they can align to some other variable. And it's never even occurred to those developers and publishers about its kind of practical use. So I think that there's probably kind of fault on both sides for that theory practice gap, where there's plenty of academic work developing really interesting, rigorous scientific tools that don't kind of take that step into, but what makes this practically useful? And then the flip side of that is we kind of have those things with the practical utility and lovely ways of presenting information, giving insight to people, pun intended, but not actually having any kind of scientific rigor between it. And I suppose what we're trying to do is identify something that's got a bit of both, but they're very different skill sets.
Yeah, I guess psychometrics, as Euan points out, but some of the less sophisticated ones, that's the kind way of describing it, are popular because they're very accessible. And it's a question of purpose, isn't it? I mean, if your purpose is just to initiate a conversation, a lot of them will do that, and that works. But if the purpose is something else, to find out something about an individual or a team or a group or an organization that is somehow useful for well-being or agility or performance, then they fall quite short of that. Now, Kirstin, you said a lot of people coming out of universities are becoming more sophisticated. I'm going to challenge that a little, because we've been interviewing people this week, finally undergraduates and one master's student from one of the Russell Group universities, and none of them could tell us the difference between an ipsative or normative measure, and none of them knew what reliability or validity was. But they had inputs on psychometrics, and when we explored that a bit further, they'd been shown some psychometric tests, free ones, cheap ones off the internet. They'd completed them, and they'd done a little exercise to explore each other's profile, and that was it. There was nothing about what makes a good psychometric. And Euan's point is about the world doesn't know how to identify a good or a bad psychometric. So how do we solve that problem?
Yeah, so I think I understand what you're saying. But a lot of graduates are coming out saying that those kind of used ones, that the less sophisticated ones, they know that they're not reliable and valid, but they also then maybe don't know what is reliable and valid. But a lot of universities who used to talk about psychometrics did used to do the BPS course in what used to be called level A and level B. It's now called training in test use. They did used to do that as a part of their degree course. So they did used to come out a lot more sophisticated in understanding psychometrics. But yeah, probably now they aren't. They probably don't know what it is. Correct.
I'd say quite right, Kirstin, because I've been involved with psychometrics now through Professor Peter Clough for over 30 years. And I can remember when he was at Hull University, most students would complete that program that you've just described.
That's where I
don't anymore.
Yeah, it's not available. Yeah.
Something that occurs to me as well off the back of that is I think when psychology students do the statistics courses at university, there's quite a lot to cover and a lot of concepts that you kind of cycle through quite quickly over the course of the course. And I think it's hard often remembering those and keeping them in mind after your graduation, unless you're actually using the concepts quite regularly. And I was just looking through before our call, just kind of revisiting the course that we developed and looking at the stats principles there. And I think it's really helpful just to be reminded of them, to go through them again and again and just become more familiar with them, because it's very easy, I think, for you to begin to forget those course concepts quite quickly after graduation. So yeah.
And as someone who's been a sort of previous roles of either course director or head of department for psychology, certainly at an undergrad, even at postgrad, the accreditation requirements for a program don't really include psychometrics. You have to demonstrate, so you've got to cover cognitive psychology, biological psychology, personality and individual differences, social psychology, what am I missing? Developmental psychology, and research methods. But there's an awful lot to cover in terms of research methods, like different types of research design, qualitative, quantitative, longitudinal, cross-sectional, and then different analyses for interpreting that data. That once you cover those, there's very little room left to have a proper dive into psychometrics. And that exists even in master's degree stuff. I wonder then, so we would have a lot of coaches listen to the podcast who are probably thinking, okay, but well, so how do I know? Because in my experience of speaking to coaches, the vast majority, it's not that they want to be ignorant and using invalid or unreliable measures, but how can they actually upskill in that? Any sense there? Like if we were talking to an executive coach, a life coach, a business coach, whatever it might be, how do you go about upskilling in that area? I don't know the answer, but
you pick up a good point there, John, because you and I work with a colleague who was quite senior in the European Mentoring Coaching Council, and he told us that less than 20% of coaches use psychometric measures. And if you think that there's one discipline that should be using psychometrics, these kind of tools, it should be coaches, but only 20% do. And of those 20%, a big proportion are using the wrong measure. And very often they're only using one measure. And so the issue is, if you're only using one measure, you're like a carpenter who only walks around with a hammer, and you'll think every screw is a nail, and he will never have a screwdriver. So it's not just about understanding how to select psychometric measures, but to accept you need to have something in your toolbox, or several in your toolbox, because it's very rare that one will do everything you want, and yet people default to that. And I think it's the reason for the popularity of the extremely simple measures. They look like they fit everything, but they're nail.
And I think a limited understanding of what's available really hampers people's ability to design good interventions. So unless you've got an awareness of the different psychometric tests that are available and an understanding of how to interpret them, whenever you're doing any kind of intervention, whether it's coaching or perhaps a bigger intervention such as a return to work project for people who've been out of work, that's obviously a big thing in the news at the moment. It's difficult to know how to design those unless you've got a sense of what tools you could actually use, and how you can measure people's progress, but also how you can use tools to select people for different types of jobs and things like that. So I think it's really important to have that awareness of the different tools that are available.
And also, if your statistic of only 20% of coaches are using them and they may only use one, that means 80% aren't using any, and which is really surprising to me, because it's such a good way of uncovering layers quite quickly and getting to be able to goal set more quickly as well and more specifically.
The 80% who don't use it, I'm told, one of the big factors is psychometrics look like frightening instruments to them. You know, they hear about the stats, they hear about the potential complexity, the science behind it, and they think, "Oh, I don't understand that. I don't understand that. I better not use it. Better just stick to my tried and tested." And there is a group, and I have come across people who will say this, and this is a slightly more cynical approach. It's picking up on what you've just said, Kirstin, is that if I use a psychometric, I can get from position A to position B, that's in one session. But if I don't use a psychometric, it might take me 3 or 4 sessions. That's more income for me. So why should I use a psychometric?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a
Well, there's an ethical
more than
thing
one
there, isn't
perspective
there?
here.
Yeah.
Those people aren't listening to the podcast, you know. It's the ones who are ones who are thinking, actually think of the benefit I could have by, you know, that first session with someone, when you could lose a lot of that session to pretty superficial stuff, which when you've only got certain sessions, I always feel like it's a little bit of a waste. Whereas if you can dive in and think, do you know what, within 20 minutes of meeting this person, we were going to levels about themselves they didn't even know.
Yeah,
I think is a brilliant thing. Again, I'm probably not mercenary enough to be thinking about it as an income strategy.
But I think there's also, I mean, I completely agree with you. That's why I use psychometric tests, but also it really helps you kind of distill those kind of things that you've found out about the person into actions really quickly as well.
Yeah.
But there's still work to do. It doesn't mean that you're not doing any work. It just means that you can do more productive work and move people forward much more quickly, rather than spending a lot of sessions just finding out. So I think it's really important. And I think also the more productive you are in the sessions, people come back for more.
Yeah. I think the cost benefits of using a good psychometric are very clear. We, between the 4 of us, we could demonstrate that, and we can give chapter and verse about it. It's all that mass of people out there who are working in this kind of people and organizational development field who don't understand that. We did a project a few years ago with Manchester Metropolitan University where we used the mental toughness questionnaire on student dropouts, and they were experiencing about 20% student dropouts. We halved that, and the comment from the head of the head of the business school was the payback is about 6 weeks. The cost of testing people and giving them feedback and having a discussion with them was tiny compared to the savings they made, because every student they lost was £30,000 worth of income. You don't need to save many students to get your money back. And yet that idea, it's hard to get that idea over.
I like the comment you made there, Kirstin, about being able to distill results from a psychometric test into actions, because that's a world of difference from something being a conversation starter. Yeah. And I always kind of roll my eyes at the value of it. Oh, it's a conversation starter. Because I always think, if you need someone to spend 20 minutes filling out a questionnaire to start a conversation, why are you a coach or a psychologist or something? We should be good at starting conversations. Now, that should be a pretty baseline skill. So when you hear that conversation start, come on, anyone can start a conversation. tell me about yourself. There you go. I started a conversation.
Yeah.
Whereas I think you've described really well there how it's not it's certainly using something that's of value isn't a conversation starter. It's something that can identify actions and hopefully produce some sort of effect very quickly.
And I think kind of building on that idea, if you're using very reliable instruments, think, with reliability coefficients of 0.8 or above, which are really quite scientific instruments, then you're also really cutting to the really the heart of issues that people are dealing with. You're helping people build insight in a way that you wouldn't be able to in quite lengthy discussions. So I think this is really building on what you said already. It really speeds things up, but they're quite scientific instruments, the most reliable psychometrics that we use, and I think they have a huge role to play in coaching and psychological work that we do with people.
And in terms of various instruments that you might have come across, are there any areas that you think we can kind of tackle pretty well, and other areas that are quite challenging with existing ones? So I wonder, for example, I used mental toughness question here, but there's other things that you can use as well, like that personal level of understanding. In terms of groups, environment, culture, anything of, for example, or are there other things that you've come across where you think maybe that's an area that's been tricky to assess and get value from with any particular psychometrics?
Well, I was interested in what you said earlier, John, about the gap between the academic tools and the more kind of, I suppose, the more kind of relational tools or more popular tools that we might use. And I've do quite a lot of assessments using both ability tests and personality tests. And I find some of the more academic personality measures can be harder to deal with because they're more specific, very kind of specific psychological traits that people might have a hard time applying in terms of development goals or things they'd like to move forward with. I'm just thinking perhaps like the Neo PIR, the five-factor model personality, which is really, really scientific. It's got some great things that we can pick up about people, but then using that to apply in work-related settings can be a bit harder for people to get their heads around because it's so precise, it's so specific. It's not such a story-based model that, for example, the Myers-Briggs might help people kind of connect with more of a meaning-based framework. And so I find that maybe a bit harder to apply with people, but obviously great utility, great reliability. But then the more ability tests tend to be easier to apply because I think people understand those a bit more. If you're looking at things like intelligence or numerical reasoning or other things like that, I think that's quite easy for people to get their heads around. Very useful again in applied practice, but a bit easier to get their heads around, I think.
It's kind of fascinating. That. Go on, I'll come back to it. I'll let you go first, Kirstin.
I was just going to agree with you and really saying that I think some of the personality tools out there are way too complex. They're too complex to be practical to use. I mean, they go down into such a level of detail that you'd need to be working with somebody for years in order to be able to get the benefit of that. And you don't really think that's practical or useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I suppose I like to think of myself as a practitioner and a researcher. I probably spend more time doing research than practice, and maybe would prefer it the other way around. But, there's some great examples there because, of course, as a researcher, what we're after is complexity, because that's trying to find the bits that we need more knowledge on, and perhaps we need to just be a bit better at completing the loop. So complexity is a great thing, but we need to be able to identify where that fits in with existing knowledge to allow people to have a road to it that goes somewhere, you know. And I think you give great examples there, because for people who might not be aware of sort of validity issues and stuff, we've got those two examples of personality, the NEO and the MBTI. The NEO is as valid and a reliable measure of a general personality as you can get. It's a really good, solid measure. And if you do a search of academic databases and want some kind of like Big Five personality measure, the NEO that's the one that I use. You'd be lucky if you can find one single study that uses the MBTI, because I think that the academic sort of term for it would be shit. Like it has no kind of validity or reliability or anything like that. But in terms of face validity, I'm trying to think now, if I had no psychological background and you presented me with the results of the NEO, you've then got to do an awful lot of explanation to say what you mean by each of those factors. So there's still a lot of work to do before it kind of makes sense to me. But if you tell me, you're like this, I'm like, God, yeah, I am, yeah, that makes sense. So you can kind of see how that comes about. And yeah, I think that's probably the thing for us personality researchers, where we just need to be a bit better at that.
Well, what interests me is I've been working with psychometrics, and I've worked with all of them for about 40 years now. I did the original Level A and Level B program. My tutor was Peter Saville, and it was the original 10-day version, where you had to attend classes for 10 days, 2 of which, by the way, were learning how to use a stopwatch to time a test.
Did you pass?
I've never lost that skill, and I've never used it either. But it seems to me that psychometrics has gone through a kind of a U-shaped curve, because about 20 years ago, I began to see the decline of the use of things like MBTI and DISC and so on, and the growth of measures like the OPQ, the better end of the spectrum, of the normative measures, Hogan and so on. But suddenly, it seems to have reversed, and what we've got is this huge upsurge of interest in the ipsative measures, the less reliable measures, but extremely popular and very easy to use. So I had a thought at one stage that as the community of practitioners became more and more aware and more sophisticated, they would migrate to the more sophisticated measures, but that doesn't appear to be happening. And I'm not sure why. I don't know whether it's the client saying, I don't understand what you're talking about, or whether it's the coaches or the practitioners. But I think there's an issue to be addressed there. And in our work, we obviously try to address it, with the mental toughness concept, which is a complex concept. We have tried to present it in a very accessible way, and to some extent that works. But I'm mystified and sometimes frustrated by, the way that you can go to an organization and they'll say, oh no, I'm using insights, that's enough. You're using one measure, you're using insights for everything, yes. And they'll even use it for selection. But you've been told not to do that.
Yeah.
Oh no, it works.